I found the seating card at the head table with someone else's name written where mine should have been, and in that single, sickening moment, I understood that the man I was about to marry had already chosen his true partner for life, and it wasn't me. If you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear this today, and subscribe to our channel, because stories like this remind us that our family, our community, and the people who truly love us are worth more than any wedding we ever planned. My name is Rosalind Hartley, and for 3 years I believed I knew exactly who I was marrying. Callum Ashworth had a laugh that filled a room and a way of making you feel like the only person who mattered when he looked at you, and when he proposed on a hiking trail overlooking the valley near my parents' home, I cried so hard I could barely say yes. We built our relationship slowly and carefully, the way two people do when they've both been burned before and are terrified of being burned again. I had come out of a 5-year relationship with a man who cheated on me twice before I finally found the courage to leave, and Callum knew every scar that history had left on me. He held my hand through the nightmares. He told me, over and over, that he would never make me feel small the way my ex had. I believed him completely, which is perhaps the most dangerous thing a person can do. The wedding planning consumed nearly a year of our lives. I worked as a pediatric nurse at a hospital in a mid-sized town in Ohio, long shifts that left me exhausted but fulfilled, and Callum worked in commercial real estate, the kind of job that came with client dinners and late nights I never questioned because trust, I thought, was the foundation we had built our entire relationship on. My mother, Deborah, a retired schoolteacher with sharp eyes and a sharper intuition, had voiced concerns a handful of times over the year, small comments about how Callum's best friend Priya seemed to be around an awful lot for someone who was supposedly just a college friend. I had brushed it off every time. Priya Delacroix, despite her name suggesting otherwise, was actually a woman Callum had known since university, French-Canadian by heritage but raised in the Midwest, and she was, by every account Callum gave me, simply his oldest and closest friend. She had helped him through the death of his father. She had been there when his first serious relationship fell apart. I had met her exactly 4 times in 3 years, and each time she was polite, reserved, and left early. I told myself that was simply her personality. I told myself a lot of things. The morning of the wedding began like something out of a painting. The venue was a restored barn on a family-owned property just outside of town, string lights woven through the rafters, sunflowers and white roses arranged along long wooden tables, and morning light pouring golden through the wide barn doors as my bridesmaids helped me into my dress. My best friend since childhood, a fiercely loyal woman named Bethany Kowalski, zipped up the back of my gown while my mother dabbed at her eyes in the corner of the room, and for those first few hours, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. My father, a quiet man named Walter who had worked in construction his entire life and rarely showed emotion, came into the bridal suite and simply stood there looking at me for a long moment before saying that I looked exactly like my mother did on their wedding day, and that was the highest compliment he knew how to give. I remember thinking that this was the happiest morning of my life. I remember thinking I would remember every detail of it forever, and I was right, though not for the reasons I expected. It was Bethany who noticed first. She had gone ahead to check on the reception setup while the photographer took portraits of me and my mother near the barn's east entrance, and when she came back her face had changed in a way I had never seen before, pale and tight around the mouth, and she pulled me gently by the elbow away from the group and asked to speak to me alone. I assumed something minor had gone wrong, a flower arrangement knocked over, a chair broken, the kinds of small disasters that happen at every wedding and get fixed within minutes. Instead, Bethany walked me toward the reception hall, just close enough that I could see through the open doors without anyone inside noticing us, and she pointed toward the head table at the front of the room, the table where the bride and groom would sit elevated above everyone else during the reception, decorated with the nicest flowers and the finest place settings in the entire venue. There were 2 chairs positioned side by side in the center of that table, exactly as I had specified to the wedding planner 3 separate times. One was marked, in elegant calligraphy that I recognized as the handwriting of the calligrapher I had personally hired, with the word groom. The other, the one meant for me, the bride, the woman who had spent 11 months of her life planning every detail of this day down to the napkin folds, read a name that was not mine. It read Priya. I stood frozen in that doorway for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were showing me. Bethany's hand tightened on my arm as if she were afraid I might collapse, and honestly, I might have, had the shock not so quickly curdled into something colder and more clarifying. I asked her, in a voice that didn't sound like my own, whether this could be some kind of mistake, a mix-up by the calligrapher or the planner, and even as I said it I knew it couldn't be, because the seating chart had gone through Callum for final approval 2 days earlier, an email exchange I remembered clearly because he had asked to handle that particular detail himself, telling me I had enough on my plate and he wanted to take something off it. I had thought it was sweet. I had thought it was one more piece of evidence that I was marrying a thoughtful man. Standing in that doorway with my wedding dress bunched in my fists, I understood that I had been naive in a way that made my stomach turn. I walked into that reception hall before Bethany could stop me, before my mother even realized where I had gone, and I found Callum near the bar area laughing with his groomsmen, dressed in his charcoal suit, looking every bit the handsome groom he was supposed to be. I did not shout. I want to be clear about that, because in the version of this story that spread later through our small town, some people imagine me screaming and throwing things, and that is not what happened. I simply asked him, quietly, to come speak with me, and something in my face must have told him this was not a request he could refuse or delay, because he excused himself immediately and followed me to a private corner near the barn's side entrance, out of earshot of the gathering guests. I asked him directly why Priya's name was on the seating card that belonged to me. I watched his face for the flicker of confusion that would tell me this really was some terrible clerical error, some mistake I could laugh about later, but instead I watched something far worse. I watched guilt. He tried to explain that it was a joke, a mix-up, that Priya had been helping him with last-minute seating logistics because I had been too busy with hair and makeup to handle it myself, and that somehow, in the chaos of printing and reprinting cards, her name had ended up in the wrong place. It was, he insisted, nothing more than an unfortunate accident, and he seemed genuinely rattled that I would think it meant anything more sinister. I wanted so badly to believe him. I want you to understand that, because I think it's important to understand how love can make even intelligent, capable people willing to accept explanations that don't fully add up, simply because the alternative is too devastating to face. But something had shifted in me the moment I saw that name in calligraphy at my own head table, and I found myself asking a question I had never asked in 3 years together, a question that had been sitting quietly beneath the surface of my trust the entire time without my even realizing it. I asked him to tell me honestly what Priya was to him. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. My father, who Bethany had gone to find, appeared at the edge of my vision, sensing that something was wrong, and I held up a hand to keep him back, needing to hear this answer without interruption. Callum's jaw worked for a moment before he finally spoke, and what came out was not a confession of an affair in the way I had feared, but something in some ways more painful, because it revealed not a single moment of betrayal but a slow, ongoing one that had been happening in plain sight for years. He admitted that Priya had confessed feelings for him 2 years earlier, not long after Callum and I had moved in together, and that instead of setting a clear boundary or telling me the truth, he had allowed the friendship to continue exactly as it always had, texting her daily, meeting her for lunch, calling her during difficult moments in our relationship instead of coming to me. He swore nothing physical had ever happened between them, and looking at his face, genuinely wrecked with what appeared to be real shame, I believed that particular claim. But I also understood, standing there in my wedding dress with 300 guests waiting in a barn decorated with flowers I had chosen, that he had been emotionally unfaithful to me for 2 years, that he had built a version of intimacy with another woman that ran parallel to our entire engagement, and that on the morning of our wedding, in some deep unexamined part of himself, he had let her name slip into the seat that belonged to his bride. I did not cry in that moment, though I would cry many times in the days that followed. Instead, I felt a strange and terrible clarity settle over me, the kind of clarity that only comes when a long-held illusion finally breaks apart completely. I asked him one final question, whether he loved her, and he did not answer quickly enough, and in the space of that hesitation I found the only answer I needed. I told him I could not marry him, that I would not walk down an aisle toward a man whose heart had already made room for someone else long before I discovered it, and that whatever love we had built together over 3 years was not enough to build a marriage on top of a foundation with that kind of crack running through it. He begged me to reconsider, told me the wedding was already paid for, that our families were already gathered, that we could work through this together if I would just give him the chance, and for one terrible moment I felt the old pull of my own fear, the same fear that had kept me in my previous relationship for far too long, whispering that maybe this was fixable, that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe love meant enduring this kind of pain and calling it commitment. But then I thought of every quiet compromise I had made with my own instincts over the past 3 years, every small warning sign I had explained away, and I understood that if I walked down that aisle now, I would spend the rest of my life doing exactly what I had just done in this conversation, negotiating for scraps of honesty from a man who had already decided, somewhere in his heart, that someone else deserved the whole truth and I did not. Telling my parents was one of the hardest moments of my life. My mother, ever practical even in crisis, immediately began thinking through logistics, how we would inform the guests, what we would do about the caterers and the band that had already arrived, but my father simply wrapped his arms around me and let me cry into his shoulder without saying a word, and I remember thinking that this quiet unconditional presence, was what love was actually supposed to feel like. Bethany took charge of informing the wedding coordinator, and within an hour, an announcement was made to the gathered guests that the wedding would not be proceeding, delivered with as much dignity as such devastating news can be delivered with. I did not stay to watch people's reactions. I changed out of my wedding dress in the same bridal suite where I had gotten ready that morning, folding the gown carefully despite everything, some part of me unable to simply discard something that had cost so much money and represented so much hope, and Bethany drove me back to my parents' house, where I spent the rest of that day curled on the same bed I had slept in throughout my childhood, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how a day that began with such certainty had ended in such ruin. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest of my adult life. I took a short leave from the hospital, unable to trust myself to care properly for patients while carrying this much grief, and I moved back into my childhood bedroom temporarily while I figured out what came next, since Callum and I had already given notice on our old apartment in anticipation of moving into the house we had purchased together as newlyweds, a house that now sat half-furnished and entirely too full of memories I didn't want. Callum tried repeatedly to reach me in those first weeks, calls and texts and even a handwritten letter delivered to my parents' doorstep, each attempt filled with apologies and promises and explanations about how he had never meant to hurt me, how Priya meant nothing romantic to him even now, how he wanted nothing more than to prove himself to me if I would only give him the chance. I did not respond to any of it for the first month. I needed silence. I needed space to grieve not just the relationship but the version of my future I had spent a year building in my imagination, the wedding photos I would never frame, the honeymoon in Portugal we would never take, the life I had genuinely believed was waiting for me. My mother, who had voiced those early quiet concerns about Priya, never once said the words "I told you so," and I have loved her more for that restraint than for almost anything else she has ever done for me. Instead, she sat with me through long afternoons on the back porch, telling me stories about her own early relationships, about a man she had almost married before my father, a man who had similarly kept one foot in a friendship that clearly should have ended, and how walking away from that relationship, though it felt like the end of the world at the time, had opened the door for her to meet my father 2 years later. She was not promising me a fairy tale ending. She was simply reminding me that endings, even devastating ones, are not always the tragedy they feel like in the moment, that sometimes they are simply doors closing so that other doors, ones we cannot yet see, have room to open. I returned to work at the hospital about 6 weeks after the wedding that never happened, and I found, somewhat to my surprise, that the work itself became a kind of medicine. There is something about holding a frightened child's hand during a difficult procedure, about focusing entirely on someone else's pain and fear, that pulls you out of the endless loop of your own suffering, if only for the length of a shift. My colleagues, many of whom had heard through our small town's efficient gossip network exactly what had happened, were gentle with me in ways I deeply appreciated, never pitying, never prying, simply present. One nurse in particular, a woman named Odette Marchetti who had worked at the hospital for nearly 20 years and had survived her own painful divorce a decade earlier, became something of a mentor to me during those months, sharing with me during quiet moments in the break room that the hardest part of healing from betrayal isn't losing the person who hurt you, it's rebuilding trust in your own judgment, learning to believe again that your instincts are worth listening to. It was Odette's words that stayed with me as autumn turned into winter that year, and I began the slow work of examining not just what Callum had done, but what I had allowed myself to overlook in the process of loving him. I did not blame myself for his choices, I want to be clear about that, because the responsibility for his 2 years of emotional betrayal rested entirely with him and with the boundaries he chose not to set. But I did begin to understand something about my own patterns, the way I had learned, in my previous relationship and then carried forward into this one, to make myself smaller and more accommodating in the face of uncertainty, to explain away red flags because confronting them felt more frightening than simply hoping things would improve on their own. This was not an easy realization to sit with, but it was, I came to understand, a necessary one, the kind of insight that only becomes available to us after we have been broken open enough to actually look inside. Around 4 months after the wedding, Callum reached out one final time, not through text or letter but in person, appearing at the hospital parking lot as I finished a late shift, having apparently waited nearly 2 hours for me to emerge. I was startled to see him, thinner than I remembered, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested he had been doing some difficult reckoning of his own. He told me, standing there in the cold parking lot beneath the sodium lights, that he had ended all contact with Priya entirely, that he had spent the past months in therapy trying to understand why he had allowed himself to maintain an emotional affair for so long, and that he was not asking me to take him back. He understood that ship had sailed, but he needed me to know that he finally understood what he had done and how deeply he had wronged me. He said he had realized, in the quiet devastating aftermath of losing me, that he had spent years terrified of true intimacy, that keeping Priya as a kind of emotional safety net had allowed him to never fully surrender himself to loving me completely, because some part of him always knew there was another option waiting in the wings if things became difficult. It was, he said, a coward's way of loving someone, and he was deeply sorry for making me pay the price of his fear. I listened to all of this standing in that parking lot, my breath visible in the cold air, and I felt something I had not expected to feel, which was not renewed love or the temptation to reconcile, but a kind of peaceful sadness, the sense of closing a book that had already told its complete story. I told him I appreciated his honesty and his growth, that I hoped the work he was doing in therapy would serve him well in whatever relationship came next, but that I had also done my own healing in these months apart, and that healing had led me to understand I deserved a partner who chose me fully and without reservation from the very beginning, not one who arrived at that choice only after losing me entirely. I told him I forgave him, and I meant it, because I had come to understand in my months of reflection that forgiveness was not something I offered for his benefit but something I needed for my own, a way of releasing the anger that had been sitting like a stone in my chest since that morning in the barn. But forgiveness, I explained to him, did not mean reconciliation, and I would not be returning to a relationship that had already shown me its foundation could not hold the weight of a lifetime together. He nodded, his eyes wet, and told me he understood, and we said goodbye in that parking lot in a way that felt, for the first time since the wedding, genuinely final and genuinely peaceful. If this part of the story is speaking to something in your own life, I'd love for you to share in the comments what forgiveness has meant to you, because I think so many of us confuse forgiving someone with allowing them back into our lives, when really, true forgiveness can exist entirely on its own, a gift we give ourselves so we can walk forward unburdened. The following spring brought changes I could never have anticipated on that devastating wedding morning. I used a portion of the money that would have gone toward the honeymoon in Portugal, money Callum insisted I keep despite my initial reluctance, to instead take a solo trip to visit my aunt in coastal Maine, a woman named Josephine who had lived alone for 30 years since her own husband passed and had built, in that solitude, a life so rich and full and self-possessed that I found myself in awe of her during my 2 weeks there. Josephine did not offer me platitudes about better things coming or everything happening for a reason, the kinds of phrases well-meaning people had offered me throughout the previous months that, while kindly intended, often felt hollow against the reality of my grief. Instead, She took me sailing on the small boat she still captained herself despite being nearly 70 years old, and she talked to me about the difference between loneliness and solitude, about how she had spent the first several years after her husband's death terrified of being alone, filling every silence with noise and distraction, until she finally learned that solitude, when embraced rather than feared, could become its own kind of companionship, a relationship with herself that no other person could ever replace or interrupt. I came back from Maine that spring feeling different in a way that was difficult to articulate even to Bethany, who picked me up from the airport eager to hear every detail of the trip. Something had settled in me during those 2 weeks by the ocean, a sense that I did not need to rush toward a new relationship or a new version of my future in order to prove to myself or to anyone else that I had recovered from what happened. I returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose, eventually taking on additional responsibilities at the hospital that led to a promotion into a charge nurse position within the pediatric unit, work that filled me with a satisfaction I had perhaps undervalued during the years I had been focused so heavily on wedding planning and relationship milestones. I reconnected with old friends I had let drift during my relationship with Callum, rebuilt hobbies I had abandoned, took up painting again for the first time since college, and slowly, month by month, rebuilt a life that felt entirely my own rather than one constructed around someone else's expectations or needs. It was nearly a year and a half after the wedding that never happened when I met Desmond Okonjo Whitfield at a charity gala the hospital hosted each spring to raise funds for the pediatric wing, a tall, soft-spoken man with kind eyes who worked as an architect and had been invited by a mutual friend on the hospital board. I want to be clear that this is not a story about how a new man swept in and fixed everything, because healing does not work that way and I would be doing a disservice to anyone reading this if I suggested otherwise. But I will say that meeting Desmond, and slowly, carefully building a friendship with him over several months before either of us acknowledged it was becoming something more, felt entirely different from the way my relationship with Callum had begun. Desmond asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He was patient in a way that never felt performative, willing to let our relationship develop slowly, seeming to understand instinctively that I needed proof over time rather than grand romantic gestures up front. When I eventually told him the full story of what happened at my wedding, he did not try to fix it or minimize it or rush past my pain to reassure me that he was different. He simply listened, and then he told me that he was honored I trusted him enough to share it, and that he hoped, over time, to earn the kind of trust that would let that wound finally close completely. My mother met Desmond for the first time at a small dinner about 8 months into our relationship, and afterward, as we did the dishes together in her kitchen, she told me quietly that she had seen something in the way he looked at me that she had never quite seen in the way Callum did, a kind of settled certainty rather than the performance of devotion. I don't know if she was right in some objective sense, love being the deeply subjective thing that it is, but I know that something in me recognized the truth of what she was pointing toward, a difference not in how loudly someone declares their love but in how consistently they show up for the quiet, unglamorous moments that make up the actual substance of a life together. 2 years after the barn wedding that fell apart, almost to the exact week, Desmond proposed to me on a quiet Sunday morning while we were hiking a trail not far from where Callum had originally proposed years earlier, though Desmond did not know that particular detail and I never told him, not wanting to burden this new joy with the shadow of the old one. This time, there was no elaborate seating chart drama waiting to unfold, no secret emotional entanglement hiding beneath the surface of our relationship, because Desmond and I had built our connection on a foundation of radical honesty from the very beginning, having learned, each of us in our own painful ways from past relationships, that love without complete truthfulness is simply a beautiful house built on sand. We married the following autumn in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard, nothing like the elaborate barn wedding I had once planned, just close family and a handful of dear friends gathered beneath a canopy of trees turning gold and red, and when I walked toward Desmond that day, there was no fear hiding beneath my joy, no unexamined doubts I had talked myself out of acknowledging. There was simply certainty, hard-won and deeply earned. Bethany stood beside me as my maid of honor that second time, just as she had planned to the first time, and before the ceremony began she squeezed my hand and reminded me, with tears in her eyes, of that terrible morning 2 years earlier when she had pulled me toward that reception hall doorway with a face full of dread, and how neither of us could have imagined, in that moment of devastation, that it would eventually lead to this one. My father walked me down the aisle again, and this time when he looked at me, he told me I looked even more like my mother than I had the first time, not because anything about my dress or my face had changed, but because I carried myself now with a kind of quiet strength that reminded him, he said, of the woman he had fallen in love with decades earlier. I think often about that morning in the barn, about the moment I saw Priya's name written in elegant calligraphy where mine should have been, and I no longer feel the sharp sting of betrayal when I remember it, but instead something closer to gratitude, strange as that may sound. That single devastating discovery, as painful as it was, saved me from years or perhaps decades of a marriage built on a foundation with a fundamental crack running through its center, a crack that likely would have widened over time rather than healing on its own. I think about how easy it would have been to miss that seating card entirely, how close I came to walking down that aisle in ignorance, and I am endlessly thankful for Bethany's sharp eyes and quick action that morning, thankful that the truth found me before the vows did rather than after. If you have ever discovered a painful truth just in time, or if you have ever had to summon the courage to walk away from something you had built your entire future around, I would love for you to share your story in the comments below, because I believe there is so much healing that happens when we witness each other's struggles and triumphs, when we remind each other that walking away from the wrong thing is not failure. It is often the bravest and wisest choice we will ever make. My relationship with Priya, for what it's worth, never became something bitter or vengeful in my heart, though I understand if some readers might expect or even want that from this story. I heard, secondhand through mutual friends from our small town, that she and Callum did eventually attempt a relationship after enough time had passed, and that it did not last more than a year, ending for reasons I never learned and honestly never sought out, not from any lingering hostility but simply because that chapter of my life had genuinely closed and I no longer needed to keep tabs on its remaining pages. Callum reached out one final time about 3 years after our almost wedding, this time simply to tell me he had heard through mutual friends about my marriage to Desmond and wanted to offer his genuine congratulations, along with an update that he too had begun dating someone new, a relationship he described as being built, for the first time in his life, on the kind of honesty he wished he had offered me from the very beginning. I wished him well, and I meant it, because the anger I might once have carried had long since transformed, through the slow alchemy of time and healing, into something closer to simple hope that we might both go on to build the kinds of lives and loves we actually deserved. My mother still tells the story sometimes, at family gatherings, about the wedding that never happened, though she tells it now not as a tragedy but as the turning point it eventually became, the moment I stopped accepting less than I deserved and started demanding, quietly but firmly, the kind of honest and complete love that every person is entitled to seek. My father, never a man of many words, simply says that he has never been prouder of me than he was the moment I walked out of that barn in my wedding dress, choosing truth over comfort, choosing my own worth over the fear of disappointing everyone who had gathered to watch me marry a man who was not fully mine to marry. Desmond and I now have a daughter, Marguerite, not quite 2 years old, and I think often about the world I want to build for her, a world where she understands from watching her mother's life that love without complete honesty is not really love at all, that the courage to walk away from something broken, even when everyone around you expects you to simply endure it, is one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves. I think about how someday, when she is old enough to understand, I will tell her about the wedding that fell apart in a barn full of sunflowers, about the seating card with the wrong name written in beautiful calligraphy, about the moment her mother chose truth over the comfortable lie of pretending everything was fine, and I hope that story will live in her the way it now lives in me, not as a wound but as a kind of inheritance, a reminder that our worth is never determined by whether someone chooses us completely, but by whether we have the courage to choose ourselves when they don't. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey, because our community here is built on exactly the kind of stories that remind us we are never alone in our struggles, that heartbreak can become the doorway to a life more honest and more beautiful than the one we thought we were losing. Before you go, I want to ask you this: if you were standing in my shoes that morning, staring at a name that wasn't yours and the seat meant only for you, what would you have done? And what has forgiveness taught you in your own life? Please share your thoughts below, because I read every single comment, and I believe our stories, woven together, become something powerful enough to help someone else find their own courage. Thank you for walking through this journey with me and with our family here today, and I hope, wherever you are in your own story, that you find the same peace and hope that eventually found me.